This isn't your typical war story. Picture this: a mighty fort, stone walls rising tall, defenders at the ready, convinced they could withstand any siege. No cannonballs thundered against its gates, no enemies scaled its walls, no fleets appeared offshore. Yet the flag of surrender was raised. Why? Because the soldiers inside the fortress thought they were outnumbered, cornered, and doomed not by real soldiers or weapons, but by a trick of the air. What they saw was an enemy army that did not exist, conjured by nature itself. This is the bizarre tale of the fort that surrendered to a mirage. To understand how such a thing could happen, you have to picture what a fort meant in earlier centuries. A fortress was more than stone and mortar. It was security, strategy, and psychological advantage all rolled into one. A strong fort, well supplied and well defended, could withstand weeks or months of siege. Armies sometimes spent years trying to reduce such defenses. The men inside trusted that the walls gave them the edge, that their enemies would break against the battlements. But all that confidence could shatter if defenders believed they were facing overwhelming numbers. Fear, after all, often defeats a man faster than any musket ball. Now imagine the garrison of Fort Duplicity perched high on a ridge, watching the horizon one bright, shimmering morning. A soldier scanning with a spyglass spots movement ranks of men, endless banners, the faint glitter of weapons catching the sun. He calls out, "Others, look!" and the picture becomes clear. An enemy army, stretching for what seems like miles, marching toward them. The officers climb the walls, see the same scene, and their hearts sink. A fort could handle a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand attackers. But what they thought they saw was 10 times that, maybe more. No matter how thick the walls, no matter how deep the stores of gunpowder, such numbers could only mean defeat. The truth, however, the defenders were staring at a mirage, a natural phenomenon created when light bends through layers of air at different temperatures. You've probably seen the most basic form of this, if you've ever driven on a hot road and noticed what looks like water shimmering on the asphalt ahead. That water vanishes as you approach because it's not real it. The sky being reflected by heat. In the case of Fort Duplicity, the conditions were right for something far stranger. The air layers bent light in such a way that images from distant villages, farmlands, or even small patrols were stretched, multiplied, and magnified until they looked like legions advancing in formation. For soldiers trained to watch for danger, the illusion didn't appear as strange science. It looked like doom. Panic spread quickly, each man pointing out new formations convinced the others even further. And once fear takes root, it grows fast. Think about being in their boots. You're standing on the wall, staring at an army you can't possibly fight, hearing your comrades mutter about how resistance is hopeless. The thought of holding the fort suddenly feels like suicide. And in the mind of the commander, there's a crushing responsibility. Order your men to fight and likely die. Or surrender now and at least save lives. So, in the strangest turn of fate, the commander ordered the white flag raised. No shots were fired, no siege engines rolled into place, no real attackers appeared at the gate. Instead, the defenders opened the doors to an army of thin air, a ghostly host painted in light. What might sound like cowardice today was, in their minds, the only rational choice. They acted on the information they had, and the information seemed clear as day. Yet, in reality, they had been fooled by their own eyes. The story of Fort Duplicity isn't just a curiosity, it reveals the hidden battlefield inside the human mind. Wars are rarely decided by weapons alone. They are shaped by morale, perception, and belief. A soldier who thinks defeat is inevitable often fights like it already has happened. The men of this fort surrendered not because their walls failed them, but because their minds did. The mirage turned them into victims of their own imagination, amplified by fear and uncertainty. We see this pattern throughout history. Armies sometimes broke ranks and fled after misinterpreting shadows, echoes, or the dust of approaching horses. During the fog of war, even seasoned commanders could mistake a small skirmish for a massive assault, or misread the sound of gunfire as an entire army advancing. Human senses are not perfect instruments. They're prone to error, especially under stress. And when lives are on the line, those errors become decisive. What happened at Fort Duplicity might seem almost comical, but it wasn't funny for the men inside. They carried the shame of surrendering without a fight, of being remembered not as brave defenders, but as the victims of a trick of light. Their emissarial, or imagine, didn't need to fire a single cannon. The battle was won before it even began, not with bullets, but with illusion. And this raises an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't steel or gunpowder, but psychology. Think about modern parallels. Imagine a radar screen in a tense conflict zone suddenly showing dozens of blips, each one believed to be incoming missiles. The command center has minutes, maybe seconds, to respond. Do they trust the machines, or do they assume it's an error? A wrong call could mean disaster, just like it did at Fort Duplicity. Or picture cyber warfare today, where fake signals, ghost armies of digital code, can be created to confuse or terrify. The same principle applies. The mind sees what it expects, what it fears, and reacts as if it were real. They only had their eyes, and their eyes betrayed them. The mirage turned empty fields into a deadly host, and because they believed it, they surrendered their stronghold to thin air. That single act changed their fate and turned their fort into a story whispered about for generations. The walls still stood, the cannons still loaded, the stores untouched, but the battle was over before it began. And that is the bizarre reality of the fort that gave up without a fight. It surrendered not to soldiers, not to siege engines, but to the power of illusion. And if you've enjoyed stepping into this strange tale of war, perception, and human error, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Because history is full of the weird, the absurd, and the unbelievable, and I'll be here to tell you every strange corner of it. The defenders of Fort Duplicity didn't surrender because of a clever enemy trick or a surprise attack in the dead of night. They gave up because of a deception crafted by nature itself. What fooled them was a superior mirage, a quirk of physics that transformed the world they thought they knew into something unrecognizable. This wasn't magic or folklore, it was the science of light bending and warping through the air until their own ships and supply lines looked like an enemy force ready to strike. To understand this strange event, you first need to picture what happens during a temperature inversion. On most days, warm air rises and cooler air stays near the ground. That's the natural order. But sometimes the opposite occurs. A layer of warm air settles on top of a cooler layer near the Earth's surface. When this happens, light doesn't travel straight like we usually assume. Instead, the difference in air density bends the light rays downward and then back upward, as though the atmosphere has become a giant lens. The result is an image lifted, stretched, and displaced from its true location. Something sitting far away on the horizon, or even below it, can suddenly appear floating high above the ground or magnified to a scale that makes it seem enormous. For the men on the walls of Fort Duplicity, this bending of light played the cruelest trick imaginable. What they actually saw were reflections and distortions of their own ships lying in the harbor, as well as groups of their own soldiers moving about on nearby terrain. But through the warped window of the mirage, these friendly shapes became something entirely different. The ships seemed multiplied, stretched into towering silhouettes, bristling with masts and sails, as if an entire fleet had arrived overnight. The soldiers' outlines were magnified and replicated, until it appeared that ranks of enemy infantry were marching in disciplined columns toward the fort. Now imagine being one of those watchmen. You peer out into the morning haze and see a sight you've never witnessed before. It doesn't look like smoke, it doesn't vanish like fog, and it certainly doesn't resemble the tricks of your own imagination. To your eyes, it looks solid, real, and threatening. You shout down to the commander, and soon dozens of men are lining the battlements, staring at the same uncanny vision. No one questions it because everyone sees the same thing. And in that moment, doubt and fear replace reason. The irony is staggering. The defenders were, in a sense, staring at themselves. The very ships meant to resupply them looked like enemy war vessels. Their comrades, drilling or patrolling outside the fort, appeared as hostile ranks. The inversion had rearranged reality, placing friend against friend in a hall of mirrors stretched across the horizon. This was the deceptive play of light, and it convinced the men inside the fort that a massive hostile force had materialized where none existed. This wasn't an isolated occurrence in history either. Superior mirages have a long track record of tricking sailors, soldiers, and ordinary travelers. The Vikings may have seen phantom islands on the horizon that never existed, chasing them across seas until they vanished into mist. Explorers in the Arctic reported entire mountain ranges rising from the ice, only to disappear when approached, even in more recent centuries. Sailors called these visions looming, or fata morgana, borrowing the name from the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, because they believed that illusions were supernatural. For the men at Fort Duplicity, though, there was nothing poetic or mythical about it. To them, it was a tactical nightmare, an enemy so overwhelming they had no hope of resistance. Once the idea took root that the fort was surrounded, the chain of command had little room for doubt. A fortress is designed to endure, but it is also meant to be manned by soldiers who believe in their own advantage. No commander wants to squander lives in a hopeless defense. Every officer there had studied enough sieges to know what overwhelming force looks like, and the mirage painted exactly that picture. To fight would have meant burning through their powder, draining their provisions, and subjecting their men to inevitable slaughter. To surrender, by contrast, meant sparing lives. From their perspective, it was not cowardice, but pragmatism. Still, imagine the bitter twist of fate once the truth revealed itself. The flag had been lowered, the gates opened, and the defenders stood disarmed only to realize that the enemy was nothing but distorted shadows of themselves. No cannons rolled up to the walls, no cavalry swept in from the horizon. The only sound was the wind across the battlements, and the uneasy murmurs of men who had just realized they had surrendered to nothing. Shame burned as hot as fear had frozen them earlier. The fort was lost, not to steel or fire, but to the cruel distortion of air and light. What makes this story more than an odd historical footnote is the lesson it leaves behind. A fortress can be made of stone, its guns forged of iron, and its defenders trained and disciplined. Yet none of that matters if the soldiers inside cannot trust what they see. War is as much about perception as it is about strength. At Fort Duplicity, perception turned allies into enemies, and safety into disaster. In a single moment, the natural world exploited the weakest link in the chain, human judgment under stress. And this isn't just about one fort or one group of men. The same principle has echoed through battles for centuries. Soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars sometimes fired at shadows in the fog, believing enemy columns were advancing. In World War I, men mistook searchlights and star shells for incoming attacks. Even in modern times, with radar and satellites, false alarms have come close to sparking real conflict. The human brain is quick to act on what it perceives, even if what it perceives is a lie written in light. The defenders of Fort Duplicity fell victim to a superior mirage at the worst possible moment. Their downfall wasn't written by strategy or betrayal, but by a rare alignment of air and sunlight. One layer of warm air atop another of cold, bending rays just enough to make the world appear hostile. That was all it took. The surrender of a stronghold that should have stood firm became inevitable, not because of enemy brilliance, but because of atmospheric chance. And so the tale lives on, not just as a strange quirk of history, but as a sobering reminder. Walls and weapons can guard against many things, but they cannot protect against the tricks of the mind. At Fort Duplicity, the deceptive play of light was enough to topple confidence, twist reality, and bring down a fort that no army could have taken so easily. Panic is one of the oldest and most dangerous enemies an army can face. It doesn't fire bullets or launch cannonballs, but it spreads faster than any cavalry charge and crushes morale more thoroughly than a siege. Inside Fort Duplicity, the strange vision on the horizon was all it took to loosen the grip of reason. The mirage that had appeared so convincingly real shifted the mood from concern to outright terror, and that terror began to dictate every choice the garrison made. At first, the defenders reacted the way trained soldiers are meant to. They reported what they saw to their officers, they prepared their weapons, and they waited for orders. But as more and more eyes confirmed the same sight rows of marching troops and a fleet of warships, the idea of an overwhelming enemy took root. Each man who saw it reinforced the fears of the others. It wasn't just one nervous sentry exaggerating shadows. It was dozens of men all agreeing they were outnumbered and surrounded. Fear became collective, and once it spread through the ranks, it was nearly impossible to stop. Commanders inside the fort had to decide quickly. If they waited too long, they risked losing the initiative, and if they resisted, they feared their men would be slaughtered against a force they could not hope to defeat. Yet because the enemy was an illusion, they never received the ordinary signs of an advancing army. No shouted commands, no drums, no cannon fire. Only silence hung over the ramparts, making the imagined threat feel even more sinister. It was as though the attackers were so confident in their numbers, they didn't need to make a sound. The garrison decided to reach for the only option they believed would preserve their lives: negotiation. They raised a white flag high over the walls and sent out a small group of envoys under its protection. These men left the gate expecting to parley with generals or officers from the Phantom Army. They marched forward nervously, holding out their signal of surrender, waiting for someone to step forward from the looming mass of troops on the horizon. But no one came. There was no answering signal, no rider approaching to accept terms, no voice calling back across the distance. The silence stretched longer and longer, but the soldiers remained convinced that the lack of response was merely part of the enemy's intimidation. Imagine being one of those envoys, standing in the open field beyond the fort, staring at nothing but a wavering shimmer of distorted shapes. The longer they waited, the more unsettled they became. They might have whispered to one another, wondering why no officer presented himself, why no soldiers advanced to claim their surrender. Yet turning back empty-handed risked looking like hesitation, and hesitation could mean punishment from their own leaders. So they stood, caught between the fear of their supposed enemy and the expectations of the fort behind them. Back inside the walls, the commanders grew restless. They had sent out their men under a flag of truce, but still there was no response. The illusion of ships and soldiers wavered in the heat, appearing solid one moment and ghostly the next. Yet, two eyes clouded by anxiety, the distortions only reinforced the idea that a vast army was arrayed against them, rather than question the reality of what they saw. They decided the enemy was playing a cruel waiting game, trying to let fear do the work of battle. In this atmosphere of dread, the leaders made their final fateful decision. They would surrender the fort outright. Better to yield control than invite destruction. The gates were opened, weapons laid down, and the fortress that had been built to withstand a real siege folded without a shot fired. The defenders had given up not to an enemy of flesh and steel, but to a mirage conjured by air and sunlight. The irony deepened in the aftermath. The supposed attackers never marched forward to claim the fort because they did not exist. The delegations sent to negotiate eventually returned, bewildered and uneasy, having spoken to no one. Only then did the full scope of the mistake begin to sink in. But by that point, the white flag had already flown, and the gesture of surrender had already been made. Honor was as binding as chains, and to retract it would have been seen as deceit. Even though the enemy was revealed as nothing more than a trick of light, the act of yielding stood. This was more than just a mistreatment. It was a breakdown of trust in their own senses. Soldiers are trained to respond to what they see and hear, and in the absence of doubt, they must act decisively. At Fort Duplicity, they did exactly that, only to discover their perception had betrayed them completely. Their minds filled in the gaps left by silence and distance, and once panic set the framework. Every flicker of light and shadow seemed to confirm their worst fears. History is filled with moments where panic shaped outcomes more powerfully than weapons. Armies have fled from the sound of their own echo, mistaking it for an ambush. Fleets have burned ships in the night, thinking they were enemy vessels rather than reflections on the water. Fort Duplicity was another chapter in that long story, where fear of what seemed real carried more weight than reasoned analysis of what truly was. The panic inside the fort transformed a mirage into a real threat, and the parley that followed sealed their fate. They were not conquered by strength or strategy, but by their own desperate response to an illusion. In many ways, this was a battle fought entirely within the minds of the defenders. Their surrender was not to an enemy force, but to the terror that their own senses had conjured. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes, the deadliest opponent a soldier can face is not across the battlefield, but within his own imagination, amplified by the pressure of the moment and the belief that survival depends on immediate action. When the mirage finally dissolved and no enemy troops came storming through the gates, the defenders of Fort Duplicity found themselves standing in silence, facing a truth far more painful than any battlefield defeat. They had surrendered to nothing. Their weapons were stacked neatly, their flag had been lowered, and the gates were unbarred. Yet the victor never arrived. What lingered in that eerie stillness was humiliation, and humiliation can cut deeper than any sword. The officers of the fort knew at once the enormity of what had happened. Surrender was not something that could be explained away as a minor misstep. A fortress designed to be impregnable had capitulated without a single shot fired not to an enemy, but to their own misinterpretation of light and air. If word of this blunder spread, it would not just tarnish the garrison's reputation, but undermine the confidence of the entire army, and perhaps even the civilian population. Military strength relies not only on weapons and men, but on perception. Once the perception of reliability is shaken, discipline falters and doubt creeps in. In the immediate aftermath, meetings behind closed doors determined the path forward. The simplest solution was also the most ruthless: bury the story. Official accounts omitted the details of the surrender, reshaping the narrative into something far less absurd. Reports spoke vaguely of an overwhelming threat, of forces too great to resist, and of commanders who made a difficult but necessary decision to preserve lives. The mirage, the white flag, waved to a phantom army. The negotiations with empty airwall of it was quietly removed. The tale was rewritten before it even left the fort's walls. For the soldiers who had stood on the ramparts and seen the shimmering illusion firsthand, the memory lingered. They whispered among themselves about the day they gave up the fort to shadows, but even these whispers carried risk. Any soldier caught spreading the story too openly faced punishment for insubordination or for damaging the honor of the regiment. This culture of silence turned the event into a kind of forbidden legend, a story told only in quiet corners and over mugs of ale, with every man swearing it was true, but knowing he could never repeat it outside trusted company. The cover-up was not just about protecting pride, it was about maintaining the illusion of military infallibility. Armies throughout history have hidden their blunders for the same reason. A single mistake, if left unchecked, could be seized by enemies as proof of weakness. In this case, the fear was that rival powers would mock the garrison endlessly, claiming their strongest fortress could be defeated not by armies, but by sunlight. The embarrassment would ripple outward, shaking confidence in leadership, undermining alliances, and emboldening adversaries. Better to erase the mistake than admit it. Yet erasing a story does not mean it vanishes. Among the lower ranks, memory is stubborn. Men who had marched beneath the same banner carried the tale to new postings, recounting the day they had been ordered to surrender to a phantom. Details blurred with each retelling. Sometimes the mirage was described as an army of horsemen, other times as fleets of warships bristling with cannon, but the core remained the same. Fear and confusion had undone them more completely than any siege ever could. For the commanders, the shame ran deeper. Many of them had spent their careers preparing for conventional warfare, learning to anticipate supply lines, artillery bombardments, and the strategies of human opponents. But no amount of training had prepared them to confront the betrayal of their own eyes. To admit that they had been tricked by an illusion felt like admitting that the very foundations of military discipline, observation, judgment, and decisive action had failed. Covering up the event was as much about protecting themselves as it was about protecting the Army's image. Historians, centuries later, searching through the archives, might find only scraps of the truth. A brief report of a fort surrendered without resistance. An unexplained change of command. A notation about unusual atmospheric conditions. These fragments hint at something more extraordinary. But the deliberate omissions ensure the full story never appears in the official record. That is how legends are born, not from well-documented triumphs, but from the silences left behind. And so Fort Duplicity became a ghost story within the military, a whispered warning about how perception can betray reality. Soldiers repeated it as a cautionary tale, though often with a tone of mockery. Remember, they would say, "Keep your eyes sharp. You don't want to surrender to a shadow." In this way, the cover-up paradoxically kept the memory alive. The official record denied it, but the unofficial lore ensured it would never truly vanish. The consequences of the surrender went beyond reputation. Trust within the garrison fractured. Some men resented their officers for acting too quickly, while others defended them, arguing that anyone who had seen what they saw would have made the same choice. The incident created a divide between those who believed the surrender was cowardice and those who insisted it was unavoidable. Even if the outside world never learned the details, the soldiers who had been there carried the stigma like a scar. Other forts and outposts heard whispers, and though the details were often distorted, the lesson was clear. Not every threat is what it appears to be. Some commanders began drilling their men to question unusual sights, to look for corroborating evidence before reacting. In this way, the humiliation of Fort Duplicity may have quietly reshaped training practices. ensuring that future garrisons would not be so quick to lay down arms without confirming what stood against them. But for the men who had lived it, there was no undoing the shame. Their fort had fallen without a single enemy soldier setting foot inside. The humiliation was heavy enough to bury in official silence, yet strong enough to haunt every man who had stood on those walls. They had surrendered not to flesh and blood, but to light and air, and the world would never officially know it. Only they carried the memory, locked between secrecy and shame. Passed quietly from one soldier to another as a reminder of just how fragile the line is between reality and illusion. Perception is a powerful thing. What happened at Fort Duplicity shows that even the strongest walls and the best trained soldiers can fall when the eyes play tricks on the mind. The defenders weren't beaten by cannons or cut down by swords. They were undone by light bending across layers of air, a mirage convincing them that what they saw was real. That single false image overpowered years of training and centuries of military tradition. It is a reminder that what we see is not always the truth, and sometimes the cost of trusting an illusion can be heavier than the cost of facing a real enemy. Human senses are fragile tools. We rely on sight to tell us the shape of the world, but sight can be twisted by heat, air, and distance. The men at the fort saw armies where there were none. Their commanders trusted those eyes, because in a battlefield setting, there is no luxury of doubting what you see. Imagine standing on those walls, watching what appears to be an overwhelming enemy force forming against you. Do you pause and question the scene, or do you act before it's too late? The commanders chose action. In hindsight, it was the wrong action. But in that moment, hesitation might have seemed riskier than surrender. This is the strange power of illusions. They take advantage of the very instincts meant to keep us alive. The soldiers reacted exactly as soldiers are trained to assess the threat, preserve their strength, and act quickly. But training doesn't account for the possibility that the threat isn't real. That is why this story has value beyond its embarrassment. It forces us to see how fragile decision-making can be when it rests on perception alone. Think about how this kind of mistake can echo in other parts of history. Wars have been won and lost not only by the clash of weapons, but by misjudgments, rumors, and false alarms. A bird mistaken for enemy scouts, a cloud of dust mistaken for cavalry, or a shadow mistaken for advancing troops. Such errors have shaped outcomes as much as real battles. The incident at Fort Duplicity stands out because it shows this in its purest form, a complete surrender to something that did not exist. It also teaches the importance of verification. In today's world, we have radar, satellites, and drones to confirm what eyes alone cannot. But in the past, men had only their senses, and senses are easily fooled. Even now, with all our technology, misinformation spreads faster than truth. Rumors, half-truths, and lies can create the same kind of panic that once came from a mirage on the horizon. What happened at the fort is not so different from how a modern audience might react to false information. People surrender their judgment to what seems convincing, even when it has no foundation in reality. There's something almost absurd about this episode, and that absurdity is what makes it human. History isn't always neat or noble. Sometimes it's strange, embarrassing, or even ridiculous. Soldiers surrendering to an enemy that wasn't he, there is the kind of story that feels like satire, yet it happened. And it shows us that human error, shaped by the environment and magnified by fear, can create events that defy all expectation. This theme, being misled by perception, also reaches into storytelling and culture. Take the video game Assassin's Creed Mirage. In that story, deception and lies drive the plot, shaping the actions of characters and the world around them. The difference is that in a game, the lie is intentional, built into the divine. In the case of the fort, the lie came from the natural world itself. Both show us the same truth. When people believe a falsehood, even a convincing one, the consequences can be as real as if it were true. A fortress fell to a mirage, in the same way a kingdom in a story might fall to a whispered lie. The comparison matters because it reminds us that history and fiction often share the same patterns. Illusions, whether made by light or by words, have the power to move armies and change outcomes. Fort Duplicity surrendered to an atmospheric trick. A player in Assassin's Creed Mirage might be led into betrayal by a story woven from lies. In both cases, the lesson is clear. What you accept as real shapes your actions, and your actions shape your fate. So why does this strange surrender still matter? Because it forces us to think about how we handle uncertainty. Do we trust what we see, even when it seems impossible? Do we act quickly, even at the risk of being wrong? Or do we slow down, question, and risk missing the moment when the danger is real? These are the same choices people face today, whether in politics, warfare, or everyday life. The soldiers at Fort Duplicity show us what can happen when fear outweighs doubt and illusion outweighs truth. The story also challenges how we see history itself. We like to imagine the past is full of bold leaders, brilliant generals, and decisive battles. But the truth is messier. The past is full of mistakes, accidents, and absurdities. Sometimes a fortress falls not because the enemy was stronger, but because the defenders were tricked by the sky. That is what makes history so fascinating. It is not only about triumphs and tragedies, but about the bizarre middle ground where human weakness and strange chance collide. And that is what Dumb Historian is all about, uncovering these forgotten and ridiculous moments where history took a turn no one expected. Because when you look closely, the past isn't just kings and empires. It's also stories like Fort Duplicity, where soldiers raised a white flag to nothing at all. Stories that make us laugh, shake our heads, and think twice about how fragile our own judgment can be. If you've enjoyed this tale of surrender without a battle, and if you want to hear more stories where history blurs the line between truth and absurdity, make sure to like this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. There's so much more out there stranger than fiction.